The United States of America has put its troops in the Middle East on full combat readiness for a massive strike on Iran's energy sector as negotiations once again reach a deadlock. U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth officially announced today that the U.S. military has been ordered to prepare troops for the immediate resumption of hostilities against Iran, as the ceasefire is coming to an end and a peace agreement has not been signed. Although the Iranians today insist that Iran and the United States have made some progress in efforts to reach an agreement to end the war, there are still significant differences. But negotiations to end Russia's war against Ukraine have also often reached the final stage. Remember, there were statements that 96% had already been agreed upon, but there is always that last issue on which it is impossible to reach an agreement. In addition, today General Dan Kane explained that the actions of the U.S. in the Hormuz Strait are not a blockade, as you might think, but merely control over Iranian ports and the coastline. We will discuss all of this in this episode. My name is Alexei Pichi. Let's discuss this topic together. But before we start, I ask you to subscribe to the channel, like this episode, and leave any comment under this video. I would really appreciate it. Also, subscribe to my Telegram channel, Peachy News. The link is in the description of this video. There we publish breaking news as it comes in. So, the rhetoric in Washington regarding the war in Iran has changed again. And now, the U.S. Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, at a press conference in the Pentagon, warned Iran that the current naval blockade is just a polite way of handling the situation. According to him, the armed forces. The U.S. is armed and ready to immediately strike Iranian power plants, critical dual-use infrastructure facilities, and the country's oil industry as soon as such an order is given. Next is a quote from Pete Hegseth. Our troops are at the highest level of combat readiness to resume military action if this new Iranian regime makes the wrong choice. Right now we're rearming with more powerful weapons than ever before and with better intelligence. We are loaded and ready to strike your critical dual-use infrastructure, your remaining power generation facilities, and your oil industry. But we would prefer not to do that. And these words were spoken during the ongoing ceasefire between the U.S. and Iran, which expires next week on April 21. In addition, Pete Hegseth stated that on Donald Trump's orders, the U.S. Department of Defense will do whatever is necessary to ensure that Iran never acquires nuclear weapons. Quote, "We would prefer to do this the right way, through a deal led by our wonderful Vice President and the team of negotiators. Or we can do it the hard way. We urge this new regime to make a wise choice." At the same time, Iranian officials today claim that Iran and the United States of America have allegedly made some progress on the terms of an agreement to end the war, but significant differences remain. The visit of Pakistan's Chief of Army Staff Asim Munir to Tehran yesterday helped reduce differences on certain issues, which raised hopes for the continuation of the truce and the resumption of negotiations between Tehran and Washington. In addition, the outlet Israel writes the following today, quote, "The visit of Pakistan's Chief of Army Staff to Tehran proved effective in reducing disagreements in some areas. However, fundamental differences over nuclear issues still remain. There is now more hope for the continuation of the ceasefire and for holding a second round of negotiations. The fate of Iran's highly enriched uranium and the duration of nuclear restrictions for Iran are among the most contentious issues for which no solution has yet been found." Again, I'll draw a parallel with Ukraine and Russia. Let me remind you that last year the American administration was assuring everyone that everything had already been agreed upon. Well, everything was already settled. The question of Donbas remained. Putin wants the Ukrainians to leave Donbas, but the Ukrainians obviously don't want to do that. And back then, they were saying, listen, 96% of the deal is already done. Only these 4% are left and they concern Donbas. But they just can't reach an agreement there. These negotiations are still ongoing to this day. It's the same here. It seems like there's already some progress. They've reached agreements, but on the key issue, the nuclear issue, there's no agreement. At the same time, the naval blockade of Iran came into effect on Monday, and today, U.S. Army General Dan Kane said that we all misunderstood the Americans when Donald Trump announced the blockade of the Hormuz Strait. According to Dan Kane, the actions of the U.S. represent a blockade of Iranian ports and coastline, not a blockade of the Hormuz Strait. So, if you hear about ships passing through the Hormuz Strait, that's something different. Because once again, the US is not blocking the Hormuz Strait, despite the fact that Donald Trump has made such statements. And Dan Kane stated that no, we are controlling the ports and coasts of Iran so that no ships can enter there. Nevertheless, the US Army Central Command stated that over several days, American forces forced 14 ships heading toward Iranian ports to turn back. None of them were inspected, all complied with the demands voluntarily. Meanwhile, Iran claimed that oil exports have supposedly been completely stopped. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dan Kane, stated that American forces are ready to resume large-scale combat operations at any moment. According to him, the naval forces will pursue any Iranian vessel or any vessel attempting to provide material support to Iran, regardless of its flag or location. And so, on Thursday, the U.S. naval forces expanded the blockade, and from now on it applies not only to specific vessels but also to cargoes deemed contraband. The U.S. has now officially designated the following categories of goods as contraband. These are weapons and weapon systems, ammunition, nuclear materials, crude oil and petroleum products, iron, steel, and aluminum. Well, basically everything that can be used in one way or another for the defense industry, all of this is what the Americans call contraband, and they will not allow it into Iran. U.S. President Donald Trump admitted that he expects the blockade to force Iran to accept American terms for ending the war, primarily to open the Strait of Hormuz for free navigation. Under normal circumstances, about 1/5 of all the world's oil and natural gas exports pass through it. And today, Pete Hegseth addressed the Iranian leadership directly and stated that Tehran should make a wise choice as it prepares for negotiations with Washington. The words of the Minister of War, that a blockade is a polite way for this to be resolved, made it clear that the next step after a deadlock would be direct strikes on Iran's energy infrastructure. However, in the fog of war, the possible outlines of a future deal can still be seen. It is known that Washington has proposed a deal that would suspend, not completely stop, but suspend uranium enrichment for 20 years. Iran wants 5 years, and as they say, they need to meet somewhere in the middle. And there may be compromises, the only solution that is being discussed right now. But it's important to understand that for a successful establishment of peace, there needs to be an agreement that allows each side to declare victory within their own country. And that's why I'll point out that even if some kind of deal is reached in the coming days, it will only be a framework agreement. A framework agreement is an agreement on the general outlines of a future full agreement. It's not a full agreement. In other words, it's a preliminary document. For a full-fledged deal, I think it will take weeks and months of negotiations. That's why negotiations are now underway to extend the ceasefire and sign a framework agreement which will serve as the basis for further negotiations according to these principles. Well, or Trump might lose his temper and resume hostilities again in order to force them into the next round of negotiations. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like the video. If you found this episode interesting and useful, I would appreciate your support for this channel's work. You can support financially through any donation or paid subscription using the links and details in the description of this video or by using the QR code on your screen. I would appreciate it. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.